It was a typical Wednesday morning when I got the letter. The kind of morning that promised nothing more than a few hours of work, a hot cup of coffee, and the quiet of my suburban home. But as soon as I opened the envelope and read the bold lettering of the HOA's latest notice, my peaceful day came to an abrupt halt. Violation of community aesthetic standards, landscaping project, immediate action required. I reread the letter twice, trying to make sense of what I had just read. This couldn't be right. Sure, my landscaping project had been a bit more unconventional than most in the neighborhood. I decided to replace the tired, overgrown bushes in front of my house with something more vibrant. Wildflowers, native plants, and a few low-maintenance shrubs. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just a touch of color to brighten up the otherwise dreary, cookie-cutter homes that lined the street. But apparently, in the eyes of the Homeowners Association president, Greg, it was a crime against the neighborhood. His letter accused me of violating community aesthetic rules by having too many colors and plants that clashed with the surrounding environment. The nerve of this man. This wasn't just about a few flowers. This was about control. I could feel my blood begin to boil as I read on. Greg, the HOA president, was known throughout the neighborhood for his overzealous enforcement of rules and regulations. He wasn't just a man who cared about the upkeep of a neighborhood. No, he considered himself the ruler of it. His word was law. And while I had always managed to ignore his petty complaints and micromanagement, this was different. This was personal. Greg didn't know who he was messing with. I was a federal judge, and I'd spent years in the courtroom dismantling egos just like his. Greg might have been the self-appointed king of the cul-de-sac, but I had the power of the entire legal system behind me. I knew the rules. And Greg, in his arrogance, had just crossed a line. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I could almost hear his smug voice in my head now, telling me I wasn't above the HOA rules, that everyone had to follow them, no exceptions. The letter had a deadline, a date by which I had to correct the violation or face a fine. It was clear that Greg thought this was a simple matter. He probably assumed that most people in the neighborhood would just roll over and comply with his demands. After all, it wasn't like anyone had ever stood up to him. They all just wanted to keep the peace and avoid confrontation. But I wasn't like the others. I had no intention of letting Greg bully me into submission. The idea of being cowed by some HOA tyrant in my own home, in my own yard, was beyond infuriating. It wasn't just the landscaping. It was everything. The audacity of someone like Greg, with his self-righteous attitude and complete disregard for anyone who didn't bend to his will, was enough to make my skin crawl. I sat back in my chair, staring at the letter, the walls of my home suddenly feeling much smaller. I could almost feel Greg standing in my front yard, judging every leaf, every blade of grass. This wasn't a battle I'd started, but it was one I'd be finishing. I wasn't going to let Greg ruin my peace. But more importantly, I wasn't going to let him get away with thinking he could push me around. With a quiet, determined sigh, I placed the letter down and grabbed my phone. It was time to prepare for war. This little HOA dictator had no idea who he was messing with, and I was about to make sure he never forgot it. A few days passed, and the weight of Greg's first letter still lingered in the air. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, telling myself that it was just a minor nuisance. But every time I walked past my front yard, I saw his disapproving eyes on me, and the thought of him trying to control something so trivial ate at my patience. He wasn't going to back down easily, and neither would I. Then came the knock on the door. I wasn't expecting company at all, especially not Greg. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, his chest puffed out and his expression like that of a man who had just won a small battle, I couldn't help but wonder if he was relishing this moment. His hand was stuffed in the pocket of his khaki pants, and he wore that smug, all-knowing look that was somehow even more annoying than his letter. "Good morning," he said, as if he were offering a friendly greeting, but I could tell from his tone that it wasn't the kind of morning he intended. I didn't say anything immediately, just gestured for him to speak, waiting for him to get to the point. Greg, apparently eager to unleash his power, wasted no time. "You didn't heed the notice, and the rules are clear," he began, stepping forward slightly as though to emphasize his dominance over me. You have violated the community aesthetic rules by planting inappropriate flowers and plants. It's a clear violation. I felt my patience thinning. Greg, what exactly are you talking about? I asked, trying to remain calm. The plants I chose are perfectly legal and in line with any reasonable landscaping standards. Greg's eyes narrowed, his stance becoming more rigid. This isn't about what's legal, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. It's about what's appropriate for this neighborhood. Your wildflower garden doesn't match the rest of the homes. It's a glaring eyesore. I let out a slow breath, aware that my annoyance was creeping through the cracks of my control. But I couldn't lose it in front of him. I had to stay level-headed. You're telling me a few plants are an eyesore? Have you even seen the rest of this neighborhood? It's all the same, cookie-cutter houses with identical yards. I wanted something different, something that represented individuality. Greg, however, wasn't having it. He didn't care about individuality. To him, conformity was king. It's not about individuality. It's about maintaining the standards that keep this neighborhood respectable. And right now, your yard is not up to those standards. I could tell this conversation wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't interested in hearing me out, and the more I spoke, the more stubborn and rigid he became. I knew the game he was playing. He wasn't just trying to enforce the rules. He was trying to break me. He wanted to see how far he could push me before I crumbled under his pressure. I stood my ground. Listen, Greg, I'm not going to change my yard just because you think it doesn't fit your standards. Your rules are one thing, but I know my rights, and I know the law, and I can assure you, you're overstepping your boundaries. Greg's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his voice lowering to a more serious tone. You can argue all you want, but unless you want to see fines and potential legal action, you'll fix this, and you'll do it fast. I could feel the tension rising between us, and for a moment I wondered if he'd actually resort to taking legal action. But then I remembered something that made me smile inwardly. I wasn't some helpless homeowner who could be intimidated by a petty tyrant like Greg. I had tools at my disposal that could put an end to this nonsense in a way he'd never expect. I wasn't about to let him destroy my peace for the sake of his warped sense of order. You don't scare me, Greg, I finally said, my voice calm but firm. If you want to play games, go ahead. But I promise you, this isn't over. He paused for a moment, clearly trying to read my expression, and then, without another word, he turned on his heel and marched off, muttering something under his breath. I watched him go, standing in the doorway, but inside, I was already plotting my next move. This wasn't just a simple dispute about flowers or bushes. This was about power. And it was time to remind Greg that he wasn't as powerful as he thought. He had no idea what kind of battle he was stepping into. Days passed, and the tension in the air felt palpable. Greg's initial threats didn't fade. They lingered, like a shadow looming over my front yard. But what really bothered me wasn't just his constant attempts to control my property. It was the fact that he seemed to have no regard for the actual laws that governed our neighborhood. To him, the HOA was his kingdom, and the rules were his personal commandments. But I was no ordinary homeowner. I wasn't just some passive resident willing to accept his tyrannical rule. I was a federal judge, and I had the knowledge and resources to deal with people like Greg. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. It wasn't the plants themselves, or even his complaints, that bugged me. It was the principle of the thing. How dare he think he could dictate the smallest details of my life? And more importantly, how could he just ignore basic legal rights in favor of his own petty agenda? I needed to make a move, but I couldn't rush into it. Greg was dangerous in his own way. He was cunning, and he knew how to manipulate the system to his advantage. But I knew one thing for certain: if I didn't act, he'd keep pushing, and this would escalate beyond just a simple dispute over my garden. I spent hours poring over HOA guidelines, local zoning laws, and regulations regarding the powers and limitations of homeowners associations. It was all there in black and white. Greg's authority didn't extend to the ridiculous, overbearing demands he was making. There were specific rules about aesthetics and landscaping, but they weren't as restrictive as Greg seemed to think. The guidelines gave homeowners some level of freedom when it came to their properties, and the HOA wasn't supposed to get involved unless there was a clear violation of zoning codes or safety laws. My flower beds certainly didn't fall into that category. I needed more than just the law on my side, though. I needed allies. I started reaching out to some of my connections, fellow lawyers, old colleagues, and even people I knew who had experience with HOA disputes. It didn't take long before I had a solid strategy in place. I wasn't going to just sit back and let Greg bully me. I was going to fight back, and I was going to do it with a level of precision he wouldn't be prepared for. The first step was to quietly document everything. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Greg, including his emails, phone calls, and visits to my home. I took photos of my front yard, the plants in question, and the surrounding areas. I wanted a record of how ridiculous his complaints were. Then, I turned to the HOA's bylaws. I carefully examined them, noting down every clause and provision. I knew Greg was a stickler for the rules, so I began to look for any areas where he might have been violating the HOA's own procedures. If I could find something, anything, that he had done wrong, I could turn the tables on him. The idea of using his own tactics against him was more satisfying than I expected. It wasn't long before I found a few discrepancies. The HOA had failed to properly notify me of the alleged violation within the required time frame, and Greg had bypassed standard procedures by not offering me a formal warning before issuing threats. This was a mistake, and it gave me the leverage I needed to start building my case. I wasn't about to play by Greg's rules. I wasn't going to let him dictate how I lived, but I also knew I couldn't just storm in and demand that he back off. This had to be calculated, methodical. The key was patience, and I had plenty of it. I wasn't in a rush. Greg's cocky attitude had already cost him the advantage, and now it was time to turn the tables. In the meantime, I kept my interactions with Greg cordial but firm. I wasn't going to give him any more ammunition to use against me, but I also wasn't going to back down. He had no idea what was coming his way. Every time he sent me a new complaint, I responded calmly, pointing out his mistakes and reminding him of my rights. And every time he knocked on my door, I greeted him with a smile that masked the storm brewing inside. The quiet moments were the hardest. The silence between the back and forths, the tension building as I carefully laid the groundwork for the ultimate confrontation. Greg was digging himself deeper, but he didn't even realize it. He still thought this was just a simple case of a homeowner not following his precious rules. What he didn't know was that I was about to turn his world upside down. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and that mistake was going to cost him dearly. The battle lines were drawn, and soon, Greg would find out exactly who was in charge. The time had come for the showdown. I'd spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence, making phone calls, and consulting with my trusted contacts. I had all the facts lined up, every legal argument ready, and my strategy in place. But despite the calm, calculated preparation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg had no idea what was about to hit him. When he showed up at my door again, I was ready. I could tell by the way he walked up to my front steps that he was carrying the same air of smugness, believing he was still in control. He wore his usual khakis, an old polo, and the typical "I'm the boss" expression, like a man who was certain that his position in the HOA made him untouchable. "Good morning," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I returned his greeting with a cool smile. "Greg, you and I need to have a conversation about your recent actions." His eyes lit up, thinking that I was finally backing down. "Well, I'm glad to see you're taking this seriously," he said, folding his arms as if he had won some small victory. "You've had plenty of time to fix the landscaping, and the deadline is now long past. I'm here to remind you that failure to comply will result in a fine, and if it's not corrected, further legal action." I didn't flinch. "Actually, Greg, I think you're the one who's been failing to comply with some important rules of your own. If you'd like to sit down, I can show you exactly where you've gone wrong." His smile faltered slightly, but he still had the audacity to press forward. "What are you talking about? The rules are clear, and you've broken them. If you keep up with this nonsense, you'll regret it." I remained calm, my voice steady as I handed him a neatly bound packet. This is a copy of the HOA's bylaws, the ones that apply to everyone in the neighborhood. I've gone over them carefully, and I've noticed several discrepancies in how you've handled this matter. First, the notice you sent me was improperly delivered and didn't follow the correct procedure for informing homeowners about a violation. Second, you never provided a formal warning, which is a requirement before escalating to fines or legal action. And last, the deadline you imposed wasn't compliant with the governing documents. This entire situation has been mishandled from the start. Greg took the packet with a raised eyebrow, clearly caught off guard, but he didn't open it. Instead, he scoffed. I don't know what game you're trying to play, but the rules are the rules. It doesn't matter how you twist it. You've already broken them. I shook my head, letting a hint of frustration break through my otherwise composed demeanor. Greg, you're not listening. These aren't just petty bylaws. They're legal protections. You can't simply make up the rules as you go along because you don't like how someone's garden looks. I'm within my rights, and you've violated the very laws you claim to enforce. His face reddened slightly, but he wasn't backing down. He opened the packet to look at the documents, though I could tell he didn't fully understand what he was reading. I didn't need him to. I already knew where this was going. I'd been here before, in courtrooms with people who thought they were invincible because they had a title. But titles didn't matter when the law was on your side, and the law was on mine. I took a deep breath, readying my next move. Greg, I'm not just some homeowner you can bully. I'm a federal judge, and I've spent years dealing with cases just like this. I know exactly how the system works, and I know that the HOA's actions here have been both improper and unlawful. So, here's the deal. You're going to drop all threats of fines and legal action, and you're going to send me an official apology. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to pursue this further, and I assure you, I have all the legal backing I need to make sure that this isn't just a small inconvenience for you. It will cost you, and it will cost you dearly. Greg stood there for a moment, his face a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. He opened his mouth to respond, but then stopped himself, as if suddenly realizing the weight of my words. He glanced down at the packet in his hands, then back at me, weighing his options. I could see him doing the mental math, trying to figure out whether it was worth it to fight someone like me. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice much quieter and less confident than before. You can't be serious. I am, I said calmly, stepping back slightly to allow him space to think. You're out of your league here, Greg. You may have gotten away with this before, but not with me. Not this time. He looked at the packet again, and I could tell he was rapidly coming to terms with the fact that he had no way out. There was no way he could win this, and for the first time since I'd met him, Greg seemed to realize just how outmatched he was. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he muttered something under his breath, and turned to leave without another word. As he walked away, I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. I had done it. Not only had I stood my ground, but I had also used the very tools Greg thought he had to control me to turn the situation in my favor. The next day I received a formal apology from the HOA, acknowledging their errors and stating that the violation would be rescinded. The fine was dropped, and Greg's influence over me was broken. The victory wasn't just about a garden. It was about standing up to the kind of small-minded authoritarianism that could ruin people's lives. And in the end, it was about reminding Greg and anyone else who dared to challenge me that there are some battles you just can't win.